So there we go. So yeah,
I'll try and piece this question together, because addiction's such a nuanced area and got so many avenues you could explore down. Like, I'm really into Russell Brand's teachings of sobriety, of abstinence-based recovery for people that have the addictive sort of brain.
Yeah.
I think there was an experiment done with rats. I don't know if you heard that one.
Yeah. Bruce Alexander.
Yeah, that's it.
I can tell you about this.
And there was like 10% that shouldn't do drugs because they would literally consume, I think it was cocaine these rats were given, but the 10% would just keep doing it till death. Whereas there was a 90% that would know when to stop. So the addictive brain of these rats or mice was very similar, in which a addict's brain is regulated with serotonin, dopamine, and when they have a substance. It's interesting because I love that Russell Brand perspective. I also love South Park. It's where my wisdom comes from, mate.
Yo, man, it don't get much better than that.
And they have this thought on discipline. And, you know, at the end, Stan's dad is like, Stan, I've got an illness, Stan. I can't stop drinking. And Stan says, right, you need to learn discipline, is basically the teaching at the end, because he's been practicing karate. So his dad said, I need to just stop altogether. And Stan says, no, that's not discipline. You need to be able to have bits and bobs in your life. There's two very different approaches there. Which one do you negate to more so, from Russell Brand to South Park?
Interesting, man. This is a great question, bro. I think there's a lot there. I don't know if the answer's simple. I think there's something really important about.
I never thought I'd ask that question.
It's a great question, bro. There's something really important about people understanding that we got a whole load of different needs, and in order for us to be able to overcome some of the addictions that we experience in our lives, we got to understand what it means to have our innate needs nourished, right? And I look at this from a holistic perspective. The way that I think about it is and this is a bit crass, but it's just simplified. I think about it in terms of like, we got our kind of like emotional, psychological needs. We got like social needs. We've got our needs. We've got needs to be in nature. We've got needs to have a strong sense of purpose and like spiritual needs, if you want to talk about them like this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
In order for us to, if people's needs aren't being met, they're gonna be in pain. So there's like a perspective on addiction which is to do with self-medicating ultimately. So Gabor Mate will say, like, rather than the addiction, why the pain? Like, you got to understand the pain that leads to the addiction, right? People tend to engage in addictive processes in order to self-medicate largely. So we're looking for that dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, like these hits. Yeah, do you know what I mean? There's an interesting study, it might be a different one, but so this is relevant, right? It's like, so I'm really keen on the perspective provided by somebody called Bruce Alexander. So Bruce Alexander, he put together, and quite a famous guy called Johann Hari, he's commented on it quite a lot. So he wrote a book called Chasing the Scream. Johann Hari wrote Chasing the Scream, which is about drugs and addiction and various related issues. But in that, he kind of refers to a famous rat park study where they got rats in a cage and they've got, I think it's like morphine, like heroin, water. And the rats in the cage, it's just a boring cage. The cage in itself is not contributing to the rats meeting their needs in any way. No, this is quite good, really good question. That's really relevant. I think it was either one or two. I forget. Okay. But that's a relevant point. But because there's nothing else in this cage that ends up meeting their needs in any way, they literally just hammer this. I think it's morphine, right?
Right. Okay.
Until the bottle's empty.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then, so it's developing this theory of like, it contributed to this theory called the social connection theory of addiction, right? Which kind of like Johann Hari's he's done a great job of popularizing, because there's quite a famous TED talk where he says something like, the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection, right? And it lends itself to this sort of like understanding that in order to alleviate the pain that a lot of us feel, which lends itself to the addictions that we have, we've really got to understand the relevance of our connections within our lives, and whether that's connections in terms of our relationships with other people, our relationships to ourselves, our relationships to the natural environment. This idea that we are parts of a wider ecosystem, and this is where it's really interesting when you start thinking about what it means to be a human again. What does it mean to be this human animal? How have we evolved to live? What does it mean to be living naturally within our natural habitat in ways that we're, if we want to say meant to live? Do you know what I mean? Well, it's not necessarily like this, right? And Bruce Alexander, what he does, he was an addiction specialist. So he's got the rats in the cage. A rat in a cage without the relationships that it needs, without anything else that it needs, none of its natural environment, just hammers this drug water, to put simple. And then he does another experiment where he gets a bigger cage, puts a load of other rats in it.
Created Utopia.
Yeah, Rat Utopia, Rat Park it was called.
Okay.
And then they're buzzing. Everybody's happy, man. They're bouncing about, they're doing their thing, they're nibbling on bits, they're playing with things, everything's cool. And then you've got these untouched, full bottles of drug water. Do you know what I mean?
And
so they're not interested.
And the normal water's just gone down.
Man.
Down. Okay.
They don't need it. Their needs are being nourished. And it just led to this sort of like, I know that's quite a kind of simple observation, and it's hardly like a rigorous scientific study, but it does lend itself to this perspective about like, it's not
what environment is.
It's about the environment.
Yeah.
It's about that stuff there. And then he wrote a book called The Globalization of Addiction, and he basically says that addiction as a phenomena, as an issue, as a thing, it's actually relatively recent. Addiction isn't always present in human history.
Okay.
Experimenting with different substances is, but the idea of actually being addicted to something is very, very recent, man. And he says he did this, what is thought of as being a landmark study that led to this big book, The Globalization of Addiction. And he says that when you look at the historical development of society, there's a particular point that comes where we first start to see the rise of addiction. And that's when we see like capitalist society start to strip the land from underneath people's feet, have an impact upon their communities and their tribes and their clans and their, this idea that our natural sort of family structures and sort of community kinship and the ways in which we'd naturally been living in ways where we felt totally connected, like we had a strong sense of belonging, we felt a confident sense of being accepted by a particular group of people, whether that was family or community. Those things were present and in place, as well as people feeling as though they also had the opportunities needed to be autonomous, if you like. So have the ability to make choices for themselves. So he refers to it as like psychosocial integration, right? A community that doesn't have addiction needs to have the ability for people to psychologically and socially integrate. It's a part of our natural development as human beings. We need to have this freedom and autonomy, this ability to define who we are as people, pursue our own goals, lead relatively free lives where we can make choices and determine the future for ourselves, whilst also simultaneously having the support of our tribe and support of our crew. When these things start to disappear or we feel insecure, he calls it dislocation, right? The process of dislocation, which is basically just kind of like having our access to the things that we need, the people we need, the opportunities that we need. When they're affected and they're taken from us, that's when we start to feel that deep sense of stress and pain that lends itself to us wanting to repeatedly abuse particular substances in order to feel that sense of self-medication and that sort of thing. It's a fascinating field, but I'm more from that sort of perspective. I think it's really important that we look at the environment.
It's the best way of answering a question ever.
Sorry, bro. I'm so long-winded, man.
It's interesting with that and with sobriety, or like where you've managed to say no to alcohol.